there's probably a lot of people that are listening who do a carnivore diet and they found for themselves, oh, I did a carnivore diet, maybe certain things as far as their autoimmune issues went away or they're feeling okay, right? What should they be trying to pay attention to, even though they may be feeling okay from your perspective? Is it, again, pay attention to your amount of saturated fat intake, get your blood work done, check your APOB? What else?
This is a great question and conversation for us to have. I think the benefits that these people are experiencing are explainable. One of those is from potentially removing certain foods that are irritating them.
Yeah.
The other is a big one would be if they are losing weight. So they're going to see markers like blood glucose and different markers of insulin resistance shift into a more favorable direction. And often they see improvements across the board, but their ApoB goes up. And they think, what do I do here? The carnivore diet it's an extreme form of an elimination diet. These diets are not new. Like, we've known for a long time that certain plant foods people can have intolerances to, and when you take them out, their symptoms subside. And so I would ask people to consider it as more of an elimination style dietary pattern, and it's giving them some information to start with. But usually these people have removed a whole host of foods. They might have removed 20, 30 different plant foods at once. It's hard to know what was the culprit, what was causing those symptoms. You get some initial information that it was something that was in there. And then the evidence that we have suggests that long-term, if they want to really reduce their risk of chronic disease, then they do want to be thinking about their ApoB level. And that could be pharmacology, or it could be the types of meats that they're eating leaner cuts of meat and trying to get the saturated fat down in the diet. It could be, if they're open to it, adding in things like fiber supplements or certain plant foods that they tolerate. And that's where I would really be going is you've eliminated 20, 30 plant foods, but they might not all be a problem for you. And you can work with someone. Usually it will help to work with a dietitian, but there is a lot of information online as well where you can start to go through a reintroduction phase very systematically to find what are your triggers. And then perhaps you move the triggers to the side, or you work out the dose that's causing those triggers and work through that in a very systematic fashion to get back towards a dietary pattern that is more favorable from a long-term disease risk point of view. But I completely understand why people are being drawn to this style of diet, and if they have an autoimmune condition and then start eating a carnivore diet and feel great, I understand that. And my role is to kind of just help people, and I want people to feel better. So when I hear those stories, I'm like, that's amazing. But let's then take in some extra information and just make sure that you're aware of maybe some other options that you could explore that leave you still feeling great today. But we can perhaps work on some of those weaknesses like you would in the gym. If you had a weakness and you wanted to be an all-round athlete and feel your best physically, you don't just ignore those weaknesses.
Nope.
Let's come back to a level where we're not causing injury and pain, but then let's work, in a systematic way to have a more robust, well-rounded workout plan that actually brings those weaknesses up to strengths.
Yeah, I think this is not really talked about enough. People being able to adjust to eating different food. I think sometimes people just think, I can't eat those foods. Or maybe in the past, maybe some people have tried, maybe they have kind of tried elimination diets to some extent, or maybe they tried like their version of being vegan or something, but maybe they were actually eating like a lot of processed foods. Or they went the gluten-free route, but then they made gluten-free brownies. Or they went the keto route and they ate keto bombs and all these different things that kind of almost mess up the whole point of going on these particular diets, which normally, I would say, again, people have a goal of like losing weight usually.
And we can't overlook the fact that we live in this modern world where there are many things that have and can be damaging our microbiome, from overuse of antibiotics. Not that antibiotics are a problem across the board, but they have their time and place. And I know when I was a kid, I was getting prescriptions for those things all the time, and I probably didn't need them every single time. C-section and formula versus breastfeeding. Not that all of that's in someone's control all the time, but over-sanitization in everyday life, all of these things are thought to be leading to a damaged microbiome, which is then less equipped to break down these microbiota-accessible carbohydrates. That's what Justin Sonnenberg at Stanford, he's a microbiologist, he calls them microbiota-accessible carbohydrates. So they're the indigestible carbohydrates that our small intestine doesn't absorb. They pass through, and they're meant to act as food for bacteria, which we have a symbiotic relationship with. And when that's working well, they can break those down and produce these postbiotics, these metabolites that then have a beneficial effect on our physiology. But we can lose the capacity to do that. And instead of those foods rewarding us through that process, they're revving up inflammation. And we have clinical studies that have been able to show that. In fact, his very study that he set up comparing fiber to fermented foods, 10-week study. And their hypothesis was, okay, if you take people and increase their fiber from 20 grams a day to 40, and there was a ramp-up phase, and then compare them to people that are eating 6 serves of fermented foods a day, kimchi and different types of yogurt, kefir, kombucha. Their hypothesis was that the increasing fiber would result in a reduction in inflammation. Okay. And they weren't just measuring CRP. They went all out. They measured 200 different markers of inflammation. What they found was super interesting. And each subject got to do both diets. It was a crossover. So you're your own control. Those that across the board, when people were eating fermented foods, dramatic reductions in inflammation and an increase in microbiome diversity, which is associated with better health.
Yeah.
So that's like a huge tick for everyone eating fermented foods, even carnivores, if they can find some. There's dairy versions of fermented foods in our diet. The fiber side, which comes back to what we're speaking about here, and maybe in part helps explain why you see different responses when someone increases plant foods in their diet, why one person says, I feel great, and the next person says, it revved up my symptoms of some sort of inflammatory disorder. It was a very personalized response. So some people, when they increased their fiber from 20 to 40, had a reduction in inflammation. And others had an increase in inflammation. And they thought, that's interesting. What might explain that? And so they went back and looked at the baseline diversity of these subjects, their microbiome. People who had disrupted microbiomes with low baseline diversity, so they had lost species, microbes, they were not equipped to handle this increase in fiber. And so they struggled. That's what that study showed us. And now they're going on and doing more studies to look at, okay, well, if you take someone with low baseline diversity, is there a protocol that you can do first before we say increasing all these plant foods? Can we give you a probiotic? Should you have fermented foods maybe for a couple of months first that help build diversity and then increase? So I think over the next handful of years, because there's a lot of different research groups looking at this, there will be more protocols for people following diets like the carnivore diet that are wanting to come back to a more diverse diet. And I think there are people out there, I've spoken to them myself, who say, I want to eat more plant foods. They're just looking for some solid direction and some sort of protocol that they can go through.
And it's also like a double whammy because like if you did choose to go carnivore because you maybe did have some of those issues and you're feeling better, now you haven't eaten a lot of those foods for a long time. So it's going to be even harder for you to try to go back to that. And then you might just feel like if you start eating some of these foods that do give you a few issues, you're like, oh, I'm just not supposed to eat them because it feels like shit.
Yeah, cook them and stuff like that, right? Like if, carrots and things like that, broccoli, cook them, soak them with seeds and nuts, same thing, right?
Legumes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to cook those, which is an important point if we were ever to talk about protein bioavailability, because most of those studies look at raw legumes. So some of those differences that get quoted are often overstated. But yeah, you need to properly prepare these foods, and it can make them more digestible for sure.
I know we're going to see a comment of someone mentioning the bioavailability, like you just mentioned, of like amino acids from red meat or meat versus nuts, seeds, beans, right? So how do we close that gap? Because there is a difference in terms of absorption, but there are certain things you can do to get more of those amino acids from those plant foods.
It really comes back to how much total protein that someone's consuming.
Okay.
So this question of bioavailability becomes more important in the context of a low protein diet. So very important in developing country where someone's just consuming grains, but also in a developed country like here, if someone's consuming around the RDA, I would say that the quality of that protein in terms of the amino acid makeup and also the bioavailability becomes more important. As you get up to 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, the evidence that we have, and there's 2 now pretty robust clinical trials that have looked at this.
And quick question, 1.6, is that, because the RDA is pretty low. It's 0.8, right?
Yeah.
So 1.6, that's double our current RDA.
And the average intake in this country, depending on the data set you look at, is between 1.1 and 1.3 grams per kilo. So the average intake's not at what we'd say is optimal for hypertrophy or strength, like kind of where we see, we don't see a whole lot of extra benefit above that unless you're in a really big calorie deficit from a hypertrophy point of view. But in these studies that we have that have compared a completely plant-based, so all the protein coming from plants versus an omnivorous diet, so a mix of plant and animal protein. When you get to 1.6 grams per kilogram, we don't see a difference in the outcomes that we would care about. Strength, hypertrophy, cross-sectional size of muscle, etc. And one of those was Hamilton Rochelle out of Brazil, who I interviewed, and the other is Alistair Montaigne. I think that's how you pronounce his name. So I think Stan mentioned that you would need to eat a little bit more plant protein. I don't think that's the case if you're getting to 1.6 grams per kilogram. Those studies show that. And if we're talking about those outcomes, strength, hypertrophy, size of muscle, there is an argument to be made that if you're not at that level, let's say you're at 1.1, 1.2 grams per kilogram, that this becomes more important. That said, and it might surprise people, there's no studies that have looked at a completely plant-based diet versus an omnivorous diet at a protein intake at 1.2, 1.3, which I think, and I've been encouraging researchers to do it, let's get that done because that's the average intake right now. So let's see at that level, because in that circumstance, if the results showed that people eating the animal protein had greater improvements in strength and hypertrophy, that could be a clear context where if you're getting all of your protein from plants, you need to eat more, or you need to supplement it with some type of amino acids that, for example, contain leucine and help you hit the leucine threshold. So at the moment, we don't have that kind of outcome data at protein intakes below 1.5, 1.6 grams. What we do have is single meal studies. So when you compare certain animal proteins to plant proteins, looking at muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy, and animal studies. And so we can extrapolate from those, and that's usually what's done to say that there may be benefit from animal protein when you're not at a certain level. And this is what Stuart Phillips or Don Layman, this is where, as far as what I'm hearing from them, and I've interviewed both, is that that's where they've landed. Once you consume enough and you get to that 1.5, 1.6 grams, probably doesn't matter. It may matter below that, and it may also matter in the elderly. So as you get older and you develop more anabolic resistance, this might become more of an issue again. So I'm kind of just open-minded to that, saying there's jury out. I see how someone might say, let's take the precautionary principle in those contexts, and animal protein could be superior. But I'd like to see some outcome studies, in all of that space, which will give us more direction.
Gotcha.
It does seem like no matter what diet someone selects, if they just go from what is currently the standard American diet of 11 to 12% protein, if they can just increase the percentage of protein, that it will assist with a lot of health outcomes.
What I wanted to touch on there was Barbara Roll's work. She wrote a book called Volumetrics, and it's looking at satiety. So often protein comes up in the satiety discussion, and forever I had always thought that protein was crucial to satiety, but I've changed my view a little bit. She did this really interesting study where she had people consume 5 different meals with varying amounts of protein from 5% up to 30%. But they were indistinguishable in terms of texture and taste. They used casseroles and whatnot.
Okay.
Yeah, we've heard about this study before.
You've heard about
show,
it? Yeah. And the calorie density was the same. It was matched. In that study, so 5% was the lowest protein containing meal and up to 30%. It didn't affect the total amount of calories that people were consuming, whether they were given the 5% protein meals or the 30%. These were ad libitum studies. So basically given these things, it said with snacks as well, eat as much as you want. And the hypothesis was, well, if you're having people eat these meals that contain 30% protein for lunch and dinner, they're going to eat less calories over the day. But they didn't. And I think that this comes back to calorie density. So they matched calorie density. I think the reason why we see protein as satiating is most protein-containing foods, relative to a lot of the ultra-processed foods that are out there, are low-calorie density foods. And so I think that the kind of obesity and weight researchers out there that are now really trying to work out what are the characteristics of food that are driving overconsumption are zooming in more so on calorie density and the eating rate, how quickly you can eat a given food. And a lot of that's coming out of Kevin Hall's work.
I think a lot of that has to do with how the food's prepared as well, like a casserole. It's pretty easy to eat as opposed to like a chicken breast or something like that. I think, and even something like, I think if you stay on the more savory side and you don't get too many flavors mixing together, my own personal experience, I've found that it does seem to keep me fuller for longer, and it does seem to redirect my focus away from cravings. I start to mix too many things in there, then it kind of gets my mind drifting about all other kinds of foods.
Yeah, I think there's something about texture that's playing a role here, and the speed, because if a 30 or 40 gram protein shake is not as satiating as 30, 40 grams from chicken.
No.
They're not even comparable.
I think it's one of the reasons why people get so hungry after they eat sushi is because you're able to eat sushi very quickly. You're able to like almost inhale it.
You can. Absolutely.
Yeah, when I make the Ninja Creamy ice creams, my daughter cannot finish not even about maybe half of it. And the last time I gave it to her, she was like, "You put protein in here, didn't you?" I was like, "Why are you saying that?" She's like, "Because I cannot finish it." But I think that's just because maybe it did have more calories versus the one when I didn't have protein
Maybe it's a
in
little
it.
thicker and stuff.
Yeah.